Well, welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 286. And this time I'm going to talk about Art Pepper's record from 1957, Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm section. This is an original jazz classics release of unknown date, which uses a 1988 mastering, which sounds pretty good. The only issue I have with this record is the vinyl is slightly noisy, but otherwise it sounds nice. Art Pepper, of course, played the alto saxophone, and in the world of alto sax, he occupies a place somewhere between Paul Desmond on the one hand and Jackie McLean on the other. He's often lumped in historically with the West Coast cool scene, but that may just be because of geography, because he was based in California. He has a gorgeous tone, but he can play with an edge as well. He made over 50 records as a leader and almost that many as a sideman, but there are huge gaps in his output. He was a troubled man from a troubled background who never could outrun his demons for very long and would occasionally inflict that hurt on other people. These days, we'd probably say his life was a manifestation of some pretty traumatic early childhood experiences. But despite many jail terms and an almost lifelong battle with addiction, he always managed to bring his A game in the studio. There were very few, if any, bad Art Pepper records. And this is one of his greatest, from perhaps his greatest year in music, 1957. Art Pepper was born in September 1925 in Gardena, California, the unplanned kid of a merchant sailor and a teenage runaway. Both of his parents were alcoholics. His mother was really just a kid. She was only 14 when she had him, and he ends up being raised largely by his dad's mother. He had a lot of musical talent, and when he was 9 years old, he persuaded his dad to buy him a clarinet, and then Pepper Sr. takes him around to local clubs and bars, and Art makes a little coin, which I'm sure made it to the family coffers. At age 12, Pepper switches to the alto sax from the clarinet, and in his teen years, he spends precious little time focused on school. Most of his time was spent hanging around in the black neighborhood of Central Avenue, going to the jazz clubs there, taking drugs, drinking, and trying to get on stage whenever he could to play with some of the fantastic musicians who came through. In his middle teens, he's playing with people like Louis Armstrong, Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins, Johnny Hodges, Dexter Gordon. He makes a name for himself locally, and then at age 17, he gets a short but very influential apprenticeship with Benny Carter's orchestra. This is where he learns how to play in a group setting. He also ends up taking over Carter's leads in a bunch of different numbers. He loses that job pretty quickly, however, because Carter's got to take his orchestra to the Deep South, where society did not view the presence of a white musician in an all-black band with favor. Luckily, though, Benny Carter does Art a favor and recommends him to Stan Kenton, with whom, eventually, he'd make his name. With Kenton, Pepper's on a recording for the first time in his career in 1943, released in 1944, a single called Eager Beaver. He excelled very early with Kenton due to his natural talent, but also began to show the pattern which is going to repeat for decades, which is musical magic paired with domestic and personal chaos. He's still only 17, he's got a prodigious drug habit, he marries his 16-year-old girlfriend who then becomes pregnant. Just after his daughter's born, of course it's World War II, he's 18, he's drafted into the Army, doesn't actually see any active service, does go over to Europe, and he is an MP, and he also plays in Army bands. He appears to have been as undisciplined and chaotic in his life in the Army as he was in his private life. He's discharged in 1947, he comes back to LA, he can get very little going on, for the moment anyway, except for drinking, but eventually Stan Kenton reaches out again. He stays with the Kenton Band for about 4 years, and in this period he becomes nationally famous. By 1952, he's getting voted second to Charlie Parker in the Downbeat Readers' Poll of the best alto saxophonist. And it has to be said that it was a gutsy thing at the time to play alto sax because, of course, Charlie Parker had turned the jazz world upside down with his playing on the instrument in the mid-1940s. And the pressure on other alto players, does that person sound too much like Parker, are they imitating him, and so on, was so much that drove people even like John Coltrane away from the instrument and towards playing the tenor. When he was with the Kenton Band, Pepper was a star in a band full of stars, people like Shelly Manne, Bud Shank, Shorty Rogers, but he never really found a sense of peace despite how brilliant he was in the bandstand, and it was at this point he develops a serious heroin habit. Life on the road didn't help with this, and so at the end of 1951, he quits Kenton's band, decides to base himself in LA, and he forms a really super little quartet actually, with Joe Mondragon on bass, the excellent Hampton Hawes on piano, and Larry Bunker on vibes and drums. Around this time, he also gets work as a sideman and doing session recordings for his old Stan Kenton bandmates, Shorty Rogers and Shelly Manne. But through these years, the heroin was taking over, and here begins a cycle of using, of dealing, of getting busted, of going to jail, of going into rehab, of getting back into using again. He spends considerable amounts of time in jail in 1954, 1955, 1956. During this time, his first marriage had ended, and in 1957, same year this record is made, He gets married again to somebody who is also a heroin addict, which doesn't really help. But somehow he manages to keep putting out fantastic music all the way through this period, particularly in 1957. Amongst the highlights are Modern Art with his quartet, Playboys with Chet Baker, Meets the Rhythm Section, and The Return of Art Pepper. And all four of those are on different labels. And in fact, over I think a 3-year period, he releases records as a leader on something like 11 labels. And I think the reason for this is A, given his personal circumstances, he was somewhat keen for cash, and also due to his personal circumstances, he probably wasn't the kind of guy that any label is going to spunk a 3 or 4 record deal on. But regardless of the label, the hits keep coming. Another great one is Art Pepper Plus 11 in 1959. But then the wheels really come off. Between 1960 and 1966, he spends a lot of that period in jail, including 2 stints in San Quentin. When he comes out, he then has a bit of an abortive attempt at becoming a tenor sax player, but then moves back quickly enough to alto and gets a gig for a while with Buddy Rich, which apparently went down quite well, but his personal troubles caught up with him. He goes into rehab in 1969. The rehab center he went into, called Synanon, ends up turning into a bizarre 1970s kind of brainwashing cult. But Pepper seems to have emerged fairly unscathed. In fact, that's where he met his third wife, who helped him turn his life around. Having barely recorded between 1960 and 1975, he then has a real renaissance and records a slew of records between 1975 and 1982, at which point he dies of a stroke at age 56. This record is made January 19, 1957 at Contemporary Records Studio in Los Angeles, with Lester Koenig, the producer, and Roy Dunan working the sliders. Art Pepper's on alto sax, Red Garland is on piano, Paul Chambers is on bass, and Philly Joe Jones is on drums. And this, of course, is the Miles Davis First Great Quintet, with the exceptions of Miles Davis himself and John Coltrane. The whole session was a piece of opportunism by Lester Koenig because the Davis Group were playing Jazz City in Hollywood between the 4th and the 17th of the month. He had seen them there. He'd met up with Miles. He'd gotten the okay to free up his sidemen to come to do this date. Garland, Chambers, and Jones only had this date to make the record because the Davis Group was booked at the Blackhawk in San Francisco in a couple of days. Pepper had never met any of these players before this date, and in fact, he didn't even know they were going to be on the record until he walked into the studio that day. Despite the ad hoc nature of all this, there was great chemistry in the studio. When it was released, it was well received, and it was a real favorite of Pepper's, who repeats the formula on this record on Getting Together a few years later when he also uses the Miles Davis rhythm section of the day. Side 1 starts with You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, which is of course a Cole Porter standard. This is accessible hard bop in the best of senses. The band is completely locked in as you would expect. Pepper just sounds free as a bird, and the whole vibe of this track is just happiness. The next track, the cleverly titled Red Pepper Blues, is, as you would expect, written by Red Garland and Art Pepper. It had to have been written in the studio. They'd never met. Imagination is a swing-era standard, which used to be in the Miller Band and the Dorsey Band repertoires. Pepper's tone is very gentle here, and Chambers has a great solo. The next track, Waltz Me Blues, is also composed in the studio by Pepper and by Paul Chambers, but with due respect to the composers, I actually think the best performance on here is by Philly Joe. The final track on side 1 is Straight Life, which of course was also the title of Pepper's autobiography. This is back to the heady days of free-flowing bebop with the unexpected bonus of an arco solo from Chambers. All that adds up to a pretty great side 1, but side 2, I think, is one of the best sides in, well, certainly the history of post-war jazz. It starts off with Jazz Me Blues, which is a great arrangement of a pre-war jazz standard written by a guy called Tom Delaney, who, amongst other things, penned the classic, or it would have been if it had been publishable, All the Girls Like Big Dick. The next track, Tintindeo, which of course was a big Afro-Cuban hit for Dizzy Gillespie, is one of the 2 great highlights of this record. In theory, it's Latin jazz. This isn't the most Latin-inspired arrangement, but Garland is fantastic here, and Pepper is just on fire. Star Eyes is next, another great track, and this has another arco solo from Paul Chambers. I'm a big bass nerd. I love that. And then the record wraps up with Burke's Works, another Gillespie track, a super memorable riff. Pepper is wonderful there, and then he goes on to this solo of many moods. Fantastic start to finish. As I said earlier on, there were very few times when Pepper entered the studio and didn't deliver, and here he's surrounded by a cast of characters who would make anybody sound good. The record has an all-star lineup, it is absolutely accessible, and it is also a triumph of sequencing. It's a record which just keeps getting better and better and better with each track. It's a must for any jazz collection, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.